In late November 1963, the United States of America experienced a shocking set of events that profoundly altered the nation's fabric. The USA was in a vicious Cold War with the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and Cuba. The world teetered on the edge of nuclear destruction, an arms race, a space race, and regional conflicts that were simply proxies for the US and the Soviet Union. The world had gone mad, and the political options that surrounded capitalism and communism came close to an ignition point many times. Despite these global tensions and problems, the major catastrophic event of the 60s would arise from a single, deeply disturbed individual. Episode 1 is about the formative years of Lee Harvey Oswald, usually, a time when children are learning, playing with friends, and working to cope with their world. However, for Lee Harvey Oswald, none of this is the case. Oswald was born October 18, 1939, in New Orleans, Louisiana, the son of Robert Edward Lee Oswald and Marguerite. Lee has two older brothers, John, the oldest from Marguerite's first marriage, and Robert. Lee's father dies shortly after he is born. The death of Lee's father and the burden placed on his mother set the stage for a difficult childhood. Oswald's mother's lack of financial security and mental stability is a dominant theme in the home. Marguerite puts her two older sons in an orphanage, and at 3 years old, Lee is also placed in the Bethlehem Children's Home. All the children sense that they are a burden to their mother. Oswald went to live with his mother in Benbrook, Texas, when she married Edwin Ekdahl. The marriage did not last, and Marguerite Oswald took her 3 sons to a new home in Fort Worth. The 2 elder brothers, John and Robert, found work, and in 1952 Marguerite and Lee moved to New York. In August 1952, Lee and his mother, Marguerite, moved into an apartment on East 92nd Street in Manhattan, joining her oldest son, John Pick, his wife, and young child. John, who had joined the Coast Guard, took Lee on day trips to the Museum of Natural History, the Staten Island Ferry, and the Statue of Liberty. Marguerite's real plan was to live with her son, but her daughter-in-law figured out her plan and confronted her. Lee pulled a knife on her and John ordered them to leave. The Oswalds moved to the Bronx, first to a basement apartment on Sheridan Avenue and then to a 5-story apartment building at 825 East 179th Street, just south of the Bronx Zoo. Lee, now 13, was a latchkey kid and a chronic truant, more likely to be at the zoo than in a 7th grade classroom. In March 1953, psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Milton Curian, never called to the Warren Commission, examined Lee for truancy problems and found him impenetrable, paranoid, mistrustful, and frustrated, with a feeling of abandonment and an unhealthy self-concept. He also ascertained Lee was uprooted, his family moved 16 times, Lee attended 9 schools, and potentially homicidal. In April 1953, Lee was picked up again by an attendance officer and remanded to a home for juvenile delinquents. A social worker described him as a seriously withdrawn, detached and emotionally isolated son of a cold, self-involved mother. The young Oswald returned to school but did little more than sail paper airplanes and refused to salute the American flag. Then Lee got a BB gun. Lee went with his friend who lived across the street and shot at the tenants sitting in front of the building and at the windows. The landlord confronted the Oswalds. They were to pay for the damage if it happened again. They were out. Lee had already been locked up once, and Marguerite knew she had to leave New York before the state of New York took him away permanently. So she and Lee moved back to New Orleans. Oswald completed the 8th and 9th grades in New Orleans. He entered the 10th grade in 1955 but quit school after 1 month. After leaving school, Oswald worked as an office clerk and messenger in New Orleans for several months. In July 1956, Oswald's mother moved the family back to Fort Worth. Oswald re-enrolled in the 10th grade for the September session at Arlington Heights High School in Fort Worth. A few weeks later, in October, Oswald quit school at age 17 to join the Marines. He never earned a high school diploma. By this point in his life, he had lived in 22 locations and attended 12 schools. Oswald enlisted in the United States Marine Corps on October 24, 1956, just a week after his 17th birthday. His brother Robert Jr. was required to sign as his legal guardian because of his age. At Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, Oswald finished 7th in a class of 30 in the Aircraft Control and Warning Operator course, which included instruction in aircraft surveillance and the use of radar. He was given the military occupational specialty of Aviation Electronics Operator. On July 9th, he reported to the Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California. A month later, Lee shipped out to Japan. Like all Marines, Oswald was trained and tested in shooting. In December 1956, he scored 212, slightly above the requirements for the designation of a sharpshooter. In May 1959, he scored 191, which reduced his rating to the marksman. Oswald was court-martialed after accidentally shooting himself in the elbow with an unauthorized .22 caliber handgun. He was court-martialed a second time for fighting with a sergeant who he thought was responsible for his punishment in the shooting matter. Oswald was later punished for a third incident. While on nighttime sentry duty in the Philippines, he inexplicably fired his rifle into the jungle. He was demoted from private first class to private and briefly imprisoned. While Oswald was in the Marines, he taught himself rudimentary Russian. Although this was an unusual endeavor, on February 25, 1959, he was invited to take a Marine proficiency exam in written and spoken Russian. His level at the time was rated poor in understanding spoken Russian. However, he reasonably fared for a Marine private in reading and writing. On September 11, 1959, he received a hardship discharge from active service, claiming his mother needed care. He was placed in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. Lee saved $1,500 of his Marine Corps salary. After being discharged, he spent 2 days with his mother in Fort Worth, then embarked by ship on September 20 from New Orleans to Le Havre, France. Lee traveled to the United Kingdom and then flew to Helsinki. Oswald was issued a Soviet visa on October 14, good for 1 week. Oswald left Helsinki by train the following day, crossed the Soviet border at Vainikala, and arrived in Moscow on October 16. Almost immediately after arriving, Oswald informed his tourist guide of his desire to become a Soviet citizen. When asked why by the various Soviet officials he encountered, all of whom, by Oswald's account, found his wish incomprehensible, he said that he was a communist and gave what he described in his diary as vague answers about the Great Soviet Union. On October 21, the day his visa was due to expire, he was told that his citizenship application had been denied, and that he had to leave the Soviet Union that evening. Oswald inflicted a minor, but bloody wound to his left wrist. His tourist guide found him in his hotel room bathtub. He was transported to hospital for treatment. According to his diary, Lee wished to kill himself in a way that would shock her. Delaying Oswald's departure, because of his self-inflicted injury, the Soviets kept him in a Moscow hospital under psychiatric observation for a week until October 28, 1959. On October 31, Oswald appeared at the United States Embassy in Moscow and declared a desire to renounce his U.S. citizenship. "I have made up my mind," he said, "I'm through." He told the U.S. Embassy interviewing officer, Richard Edward Snyder, that he had been a radar operator in the Marine Corps and that he had voluntarily stated to unnamed Soviet officials that as a Soviet citizen, he would make known to them such information concerning the Marine Corps and his specialty as he possessed. He intimated that he might know something of special interest. Such statements led to Oswald's hardship honorable military reserve discharge being changed to undesirable. The story of the defection of a former US Marine to the Soviet Union was reported by both the Associated Press and United Press International. In January 1960, Lee Oswald was sent to Minsk, Belarus, to work as a lathe operator at the Gorizont Electronics factory, which produced radios, televisions, and military and space electronics. Oswald received a government-subsidized, fully furnished studio apartment in a prestigious building, and an additional supplement to his factory pay, which allowed him to have a comfortable standard of living by working-class Soviet standards. However, he was kept under constant surveillance. From 1960 to early 1961, Oswald was in a relationship with Ella German, a Belarusian co-worker born in 1937. They ate together in the factory cafeteria daily and dated about twice weekly. German later described Oswald as a pleasant-looking guy with a good sense of humor, not as rough and rude as the men here. She did not love him but thought he was lonely and continued to date him out of pity. Their relationship became more serious, in Oswald's eyes, during the summer and fall of 1960 but began to deteriorate after German learned that Oswald had been seeing other women. On January 2, 1961, Oswald proposed, but German refused. Oswald wrote in his diary in January 1961, "I am starting to reconsider my desire about staying. The work is drab, and the money I get has nowhere to be spent. There are no nightclubs, bowling alleys, or places of recreation except the trade union dances. I have had enough." Shortly afterward, Oswald, who had never formally renounced his US citizenship, wrote to the US Embassy of the United States in Moscow, requesting the return of his American passport and proposing to return to the US. In March 1961, Oswald met Marina Prusakova, born 1941, a 19-year-old pharmacology student. They married 6 weeks later. On May 24, 1962, Oswald and Marina applied at the US Embassy in Moscow for documents that enabled her to immigrate to the US. On June 1, the US Embassy gave Oswald a repatriation loan of $435.71 to purchase tickets to return to the US. The Oswald's first child, June, was born on February 15, 1962. Oswald, Marina, and their infant daughter left for the United States.